Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Pi Day of Giving virtual speaker series event, Maintaining Your Privacy While Working from Home. Before we begin today, I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement of the traditional territory in which we are gathering today. Our university campus is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Because everyone is turning with us remotely across a variety of cities, we really don't want to forgo this important element of reconciliation. So I'd like to ask everyone here to take a moment to reflect on the traditional territory that you're on, the treaty that it's covered under, and your own personal relationship with the land. As a university community, we are dedicated to continuing increasing our awareness, our understanding, and our gratitude for the lands we share. My name is Jody Cowan, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at Ontario Tech University. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's session is with Dr. Rajen Akalu, the 8th out of 10 sessions we're hosting with our Ontario Tech experts to share the research and spread the word about our Pi Day of Giving. This will help raise funds for our Student Relief Fund, which helps students who have been impacted by COVID-19. And I'd like to thank those of you who made a gift online when registering for today's session. There will be point for questions and answers at the end of our presentation, so I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen today at any point during Dr. Rajan's talk, and we will do our best to get to them all. These sessions are being recorded and will be posted on our website so you can watch them again or share with friends who didn't make it with us live. You can also tune in to the sessions you missed last week, which are some terrific examples of the work that we're doing here at Ontario Tech. So I'd now like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Rajan Akalu is a professor in the Faculty of Business and Information Technology, where he teaches legal environment of business and law and ethics of IT. He is also the founder of Akalu Law Professional Corporation. His research interests, as well as law firm practice areas, relate to information privacy law and technology. Dr. Akalu completed his PhD at Delft Technical University in the Netherlands on the regulation of wireless technology. He holds a Master of Laws degree from the London School of Economics and a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of East London. Dr. Akalu previously worked at the Center for Information Technology, the Center for Information Communication Technology, Denmark Technical University, and the Center for Innovation Law and Policy at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. He has also worked in law firms in New York and Toronto, as well as Information Privacy Commissioner and the Commission for Communications Regulation in Ireland. So feel free to turn on your camera, Rajan, and I'd like to turn it over to you for your presentation on maintaining your privacy while working from home. Please take it away, Dr. Akalu.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that introduction, Jody. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate being here today with you all. As Jody mentioned, I research on the area of information privacy law, and I teach a subject on that on that as well. And my research primarily focuses on information privacy as it relates to technologies. So mainly artificial intelligence, connected and automated vehicles, and I also run a law practice. So I have a practical insight, advising clients on some of these matters, and have also worked in the regulatory environment for the Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario too. So lots of discuss around privacy because it has a really interesting theoretical dimension. And it relates to everyone, so it's quite practical. So what we'll be talking about in today's session is those risks and how to mitigate those risks while working from home. So by way of introduction, I'll first talk to you about some of the privacy risks working from home, and this is a deeply important topic to everybody given the pandemic. Then I'll discuss, secondly, how to mitigate against some of those risks, how to protect your privacy while working from home. And then I'll end with some discussion around new privacy legislation. There's been a lot of discussion in the privacy community both in the practitioner community and the academic community, in fact, on a new privacy legislation that will replace PIPEDA, which is our current private sector legislation. PIPEDA stands for the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. So privacy is a huge topic. And again, it means something slightly different to everybody, because we all have a subjective understanding of when our privacy is violated in some way. It's deeply personal, and it's necessary to have privacy in order to have, for you to develop as a person. But in the business context, it's important for compliance primarily of the corporate enterprise with privacy legislation. And if you understand that, privacy legislation occurs both at the provincial level and at the federal level in this country, but it also takes into account the fact that information flows across borders too. So you need to have an understanding of other jurisdictions when you're discussing privacy. Notably, the European Union particularly is very, very strong and actually drives a lot of our current legislative reform, in fact. Okay, so with respect, if we hone in on the issue of working from home specifically, there are essentially two systemic risks. Right? The first risk relates to employers unduly breaching employee privacy rights. I mean, that's going to be a big concern for employees. It's a massive shift that it was sort of unanticipated. But people have been working remotely for some time, but not on this scale at all. So there are rights to privacy that you have even if you are in employment. And right now, one of the big topics is whether or not whether or not mandatory COVID testing constitutes a violation of privacy. We can discuss that in question time if you like. And then secondly, there is the issue of employees that mishandle customer information, and so that opens liability for the company, and they need to devise a strategy for that as well. So with respect to employee rights to privacy, it really depends on the context. Privacy is one of these areas of law that is highly dependent on the situation. Right? So when we are and employers legitimately have a right to monitor their employees, but the question is to what degree? What's reasonable under the circumstances? And to make that determination, you need to have an understanding of the law, how other cases have been decided in that area, and the nature of the workplace, of course, as well. So it's clearly legitimate for an employer to have the employee note the number of hours that they work, for example, right? I mean, how else would they determine how much they get paid if they're working on that basis, right? But employers increasingly, some unscrupulous employers engage in lots of other types of quite invasive surveillance of their employees, and that sort of runs the range of keystroke logging to continuous screen capture, and it's very, very oppressive work environment to work like that. So if you imagine you're working from home, and you're constantly being monitored in this way, it adds tremendously to the stress of the job, in fact. But again, it depends really on the type of job that you're in. Now, in order to get around this this problem, I mean, the employer has to demonstrate that there is some legitimate purpose behind they're monitoring, right? So whether or not it's compliance with employment standards or ensuring the protection of corporate assets, increasingly now there have been concerns around cyber attacks and complying with quarantine orders. All of those things are legitimate. The general rule for employers is that they have to balance privacy interests of their employees with the legitimate business purpose. So they've got to demonstrate there's a clear business reason for engaging in that monitoring, right? And have a policy in place to demonstrate that they follow. A second risk is that of employees mishandling personal data. Right? So oftentimes what happens is that employees get frustrated with security or the security that is in place, and they devise workarounds such as using Gmail or their private email address in order to get the job done. Right? That is problematic to the extent that they are dealing with personal data. Now, personal data in law, with respect to the privacy law in Canada, refers to information about an identifiable individual, right? So what we need to figure out is, if you're dealing with personal information, now the act applies. Now the corporation is going to be responsible for protecting that data. So that's why they are going to be very concerned around ensuring that the employee is using the corporate email address, that they're not using unsecured Wi-Fi, and then they take steps to ensure that personal information, if it's been used by the employee, is protected within the home workspace. So here are some privacy risk management strategies that can be used by employers for their employees and for you as an employee. Right? One of the key documents that in any litigation that will be accessed or in discovery will be the policy, the work from home policy. So that has to be very, very well explained and articulated to the employees. And this needs to be communicated to them, of course. There needs to be mechanisms in place to report security incidents and privacy breaches, because that is in fact a requirement now under the data breach notification laws. That the employer, so we at Ontario Tech get alerts around phishing scams, for example, and as well as practical guidance on how to deal with fraudulent activity. Right? So you need to sort of make it almost a part of your daily practice in a way to be conscious of these things. So having strong access controls is also quite important in updating of passwords, having strong passwords. That is desirable too. The policy would almost certainly prohibit the use of unsecured Wi-Fi and mandate the use of work-related email accounts. While at home, if there is personal information, that it should be in locked filing cabinets away from other family members potentially. So there needs to be reasonable steps to secure those workspaces. But really, it's really about privacy protection is sort of really, as a practical matter, part of a wider discussion around information management within the organization. If the information is managed, from retention or collection, use, disclosure, and ultimately destruction, if there is a cycle in place for that information, it's generally the case that organization is well placed to deal with threats as they arise. So there needs to be a secure policy, a plan to destroy personal information, regardless of its format. And lastly, there needs to be a good record keeping practices in place. Not, it can be difficult if you're at home. Things sort of tend to slide depending on the employee, but and their personal situation sometimes, and it's necessary to have a good filing system and record management procedures and practices in place. So I'll end with some new developments in privacy law. In November of last year, the federal government enacted or proposed a bill, Bill C-11, which is the Digital Charter Implementation Act. It's gone through its first reading. It will repeal the Personal Electronic Documents Act and provide a entirely new privacy structure. And this has kind of been 20 years in the making, so it's a massive overhaul of private sector legislation in Ontario. It's a really big deal. What it is, one of the main motivations for this has been the fact that the European Union reviews the legislation of third countries, so Canada is a third country outside of the European Union, for its adequacy. So there are very high standards for privacy in the European Union. And in order for Canadian companies to remain competitive and handle data, personal data of European Union citizens, it needs to have good, robust privacy procedures in place, right? But it's also necessary to, it's been necessary to update the law for a number of other reasons, which I'm happy to discuss with you as well. Up until this point, there hasn't been fines being levied against employers that violate privacy law, which is quite interesting. But now there are very, very large fines, upwards of 10 million or 3% of 5% of the company's gross revenue, which is potentially quite a lot. So stronger enforcement for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And then there are these new privacy rights that haven't been used and are still being worked out. Lots of debate around this in the privacy community. And this relates to data portability, which is the idea that you should be able to port your personal information from one company to another in order to increase competition within the marketplace. How that framework is set up is not yet clear. But that's to do with creating a data trust, and those are being worked out now. Issues of algorithmic transparency is also very new. So this deals with the fact that you'll see when you are interacting with companies now, you're often interacting with chat boxes, and there are decisions that are made through artificial intelligence. And so this provision deals with your right to have an explanation on how decisions have been made when your personal information is implicated. And you can understand that it'll have tremendous implications if you're, for example, denied a loan or denied housing based on, or denied a service based on an algorithm that has been set up by a company. Then it talks about standards of consent and how that is different. Consent has been, for the most part, the sort of central controlling factor. So the theoretical model is that I have personal information and I consent to sharing it with you for purposes that have been specified, right? That has been increasingly unworkable, because once consent occurs, it's very, very difficult to determine how that information is shared. And so it has been, there are some sort of exceptions to the consent requirement to allow businesses to make use of data if they strip or de-identify that information, so they don't have to go back to the customer or that individual time and time again, which can be quite expensive. And lastly, there is a new provision to create codes of practice, which will allow for individuals to, or companies to demonstrate compliance with the law. And in Ontario, the Ontario government has started its own private sector reform. So we may see an entirely new legislation, made in Ontario dealing with privacy law, like there is in BC. So in Ontario, private sector privacy matters are dealt with at the federal level, whereas in BC it's dealt provincially because they have their own legislation. So Ontario is proposing to have its own legislation for constitutional reasons. More can be done, within with an Ontario Made in Ontario Act, actually. But we'll have to see whether or not that will occur. So to end there, I will conclude by saying that there should be, be quite proactive in implementing working from home or telecommunications practices. You need to clearly define privacy expectations when working from home and provide ongoing training, of course, for employees. And keep an eye on legislative reform in this area because it will be considerable, and we'll see that in the months and year ahead. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Rajan. Definitely a timely topic, given the fact that we are all here working from home and doing our best to keep each other and our company safe. So we had lots of great questions coming in from our audience. And the first one goes back to one of your first slides. And it's a point of noting the number of hours. So when you mentioned screen capturing and keystroking, is that something that companies are doing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? So meaning a lot of parents are working from home. They need to get their kids online for classes. They need to, have interruptions throughout the day. So is that going on after hours? So how is that being captured and accounted for? Are there rules around that? And then the second part of that question is, do employers have an obligation to tell you what kind of monitoring that they're conducting with regards to keystrokes and screen captures?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are engaged in very invasive practices like keystroke logging, I mean, it is entirely necessary to be communicating that to the employee. I mean, that would be completely unreasonable to engage in that type of practice otherwise, and you'd have to justify it too, right? So it's one of the difficulties with privacy is that you won't be able to point to a specific legislation. There's no specific rule because, again, it really depends on the situation, right, that you're dealing with, right? So maybe keystroke logging is reasonable and necessary if you are dealing with a bank, for example, right? And you want to be able to record, provide an audit trail as to who entered that figure when that money was transmitted from one account, wired to one account to another, right? But I mean, in another context where let's say you as an employee of Ontario Tech, right? It would be completely unreasonable to be monitoring every movement. So you have to be able to justify that to the employer, to the employee, and also for the matter of compliance with the legislation as well. So keystroke locking does occur, but I mean, if employers are, what employers can't do is surreptitiously track their employees. Right. That's completely not permitted.
Okay. Now, another part of that question was, so think about doing telephone work under COVID restrictions while working from home. Do employment regulations already cover whether or not an employee needs to be issued like a work phone, or do they have a requirement to protect the employee's information, their phone number, their name, if they use their own telephone, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, the employer certainly does have a an obligation to protect the employee for sure, right? So, if you're using, it would be necessary for you to have document all of the assets, so the corporate assets that are in use by the company, right? And to the extent that individual is using their personal phone, there should be, or there are, ways of policies that can be set up that you can use your phone securely for work purposes, right? So, it's all part of there are lots of great resources on BYOD, which is Bring Your Own Device, which have been issued by the privacy regulator, which goes into very specific detail on which applications you can get your employees to use. Normally, it will be a requirement for the employer to, if you're using the phone for work, that you're using a work phone, or you are like, for example, my laptop is a university laptop. It's that we communicate by virtual private network, for example, to make it more secure.
So last question really quickly, because we have a little bit of time left. Do you ever think that there will be a global governing body rather than governance from independent nations, and then further to that, provincial regulations? As you mentioned, BC has their own and Ontario has their own. Do you think that a transparent global governing body would be the right decision, or are we best served by having separate regulatory entities?
No, I think a global body protecting privacy would be a complete disaster. I mean, so it would be Big Brother on a globe. It's terrible. So that's completely unworkable, right? So your privacy is a result of, and this is kind of the theoretical component, I would say, right? Privacy is the product of a society's expectation in some level, right? And so when we talk about reasonable expectations of privacy, we decide as a society what that means, right? And every society, views that differently, right? So if every country, if you think about it, think that's true, right? If you had one kind of global entity that determined what constitutes privacy for everybody, right? That is a recipe for a totalitarian disaster, right? And so, but it's an interesting question, So, it would be a situation where authentication would be, perfect, right? Because we'd be able to track everybody all the time, right? But then privacy would have absolutely no meaning. Right, and then because you need everybody kind of has a right and expectation to privacy, because we all develop in slightly different ways, right? And it's necessary for us to be able to explore things, ideas, particularly in our own way, and arrive to our own conclusions, right? So it's a deep kind of philosophical idea, in fact, that would not be best served by having it globally imposed, for sure. And so, with respect to the provincial federal split, what is very interesting about the because there, as I mentioned, constitutional restrictions, it's the case that property and civil rights are regulated by the provinces, right? So they have jurisdiction over that, and it's sort of an interesting question, because privacy is a property and civil rights issue for the most part, right? But information travels across provinces, so it's dealt with through a federal law, right? But there are things that the federal law cannot do, right? It can't deal with employment privacy, for example. It cannot deal with mental health issues, right? Those health matters can only be dealt with at the provincial level, right? And so there is debate around whether or not a Made in Ontario Act would actually serve Ontarians better. Because right now, if you have a privacy problem with a company, it's counterintuitive that's a company in Ontario. It's counterintuitive that you have to deal with a federal law. I mean, we understand it as privacy lawyers, no problem. But I mean, for the average consumer, that's not the case, right? And so issues like consent for mental health, consent in for youth, employment issues, which is a big privacy problem. Those can't be dealt with through no federal regulation, because that would be unconstitutional. And so there's a big discussion around whether or not a privacy law made in Ontario would protect Ontarians better and make us more competitive.
Well, this has just been so fascinating and really does drive home Ontario Tech's commitment to delivering tech with a conscience. So thanks so much for lending your expertise to us today. I think that it's been a fascinating half an hour. So thank you.
Okay,
Rajan.
great. Well, thanks very much.
You're welcome. So as I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation today, this is our fourth Pi Day of Giving, where we celebrate the infinite possibilities for our students here at Ontario Tech. This year has been a little bit difficult for everybody, as we can all imagine. And although we're able to switch to virtual learning to online within one day, we are really looking forward to getting back on campus with our students soon. But our students do need help more than ever. So I would like to encourage everyone joining us today to make a gift to our Student Relief Fund to help students who are experiencing urgent financial need due to unexpected loss or reduction in part-time jobs. All donations will be matched dollar for dollar. I do want to give a shout out to Kemp Travel Group for doing the generous sponsorship of today's program and all of our Pi Day of Giving activities. I'm really pleased to share that we've been able to disperse nearly $400,000 to students on top of our regular scholarship and bursary program this year, which is great. I really do hope that you will join us for lunch for the remainder of the week. We have some really great sessions coming up tomorrow and on Friday. And again, you can check out the sessions that you may have missed last week on our website at ontariotechu.ca/Pi Day. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Rajan Akalu. And before we say goodbye, I'd like to just share a really quick short message from our students here at Ontario Tech, thanking you for your support for our Pi Day of Giving. Have a great day, everybody.
On March 14th, you can help support our students. And just like Pi, the opportunities for students with a passion are infinite. So join our circle and support higher education.